Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball. I'm Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe, and this is my weekly analysis of the geopolitical scene. Last week, I broached the topic of defence spending, and I'd like to come back to this week. It's clear that the COVID-19 crisis is as much an economic as a health crisis, and defence spending is going to come under pressure like all government spending once governments have to reduce their massive deficits in the wake of the crisis. For Europe, this is somewhat of a paradox because just before the virus broke in February and March, there were signs that the Europeans were turning the corner on defence. Nine countries in Europe, part of the NATO alliance, had hit the 2% of GDP target, which NATO established back in 2014. Germany showed one of the largest individual increases at 15%. And it's not just a question of spending more money, it's more important what you spend the money on. And for the first time in several years, many European countries were launching big acquisition and modernization programs. Germany, again, for example, deciding to buy 30 American F-18 aircraft and 50 new Eurofighters. France investing an extra 3.5 billion euros in modernizing its space capabilities. Poland buying Patriot air defense systems. Many European countries also were modernizing their land armaments as well as their navies. Also, there were signs that the Europeans were becoming smarter about international cooperation. For example, the Germans had decided to buy frigates from the Netherlands. The French naval group had begun to merge with the Italian Fincantieri to achieve much greater economies of scale. And just this week, another example of a smarter approach to defence, when NATO announced that it had procured the first of two Airbus 330 aircraft, which are multi-functional. They can be used as tankers for in-flight refueling. They can be used to transport medical supplies to deal with COVID-19. They can be used to transport European forces to faraway theatres like in the Sahel or in the Middle East. Smart defence finally seemed to be becoming a reality. But the danger now is that that recovery could be nipped in the bud. And as the Europeans inevitably have to come to terms with decreasing defence budgets, their margin of manoeuvre is going to be tighter. And it's going to be even more important that the Europeans cooperate closely to manage the decline in a way that does minimum damage to their defence capabilities, because COVID, of course, has not improved the geopolitical scene. Now, there are certain things that they could concentrate on. One is ensuring that as budgets go down, the key emerging capabilities, which are going to determine conflict in the 21st century, are ring-fenced. I'm talking here about key technologies such as space capabilities, such as cyber capabilities, stealth capabilities, even practical things like bridging equipment to get over rivers. Those capabilities need to be carefully nurtured as part of the future European defence industry and technology base. I'm talking about prioritizing missions so that the Europeans concentrate on the things that really matter, for instance, in Mali or the Sahel. I'm also talking about things like more greater burden sharing. As the budgets go down, the ability of all countries to hold up the umbrella equitably will become more important. And of course, the ability of the EU to play a leading role here by making sure that the European Defence Fund is well stocked. And it's quite worrying that what was going to be a fund of 13 billion euros is now shrinking to as little as 7 billion euros. Finally, it's going to be important for the Europeans not just to think what kind of capabilities that they retain, but to have a more serious in-depth thinking on what defence is actually for. There are three functions of defence: fighting, assisting, or stabilising. And does Europe want to do all three? Just last week, Richard Clark, the general who commands the US Special Forces, gave an interesting presentation in the United States where he argued that this was time to fundamentally rethink the mission of America's Special Forces away from what he called kicking doors in to things like cyber defense, fighting in the information space, assisting the civilian authorities. And COVID has shown that we need our forces for helping us in a crisis well beyond just simply traditional collective defense. So I would argue that not only should we look at defense spending, but how we reorganize our military forces for the kind of missions that we want them to do today. This calls for a European white paper, which I believe is going to be one of the key issues in European strategic autonomy as we emerge from the crisis. And before I close, a few words on cybersecurity. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis, we've all been working from home, spending most of our days looking at computer screens and sharing a vast amount of data between our home laptops and our offices. This means that there is now even more data out there and therefore more things for cyber criminals to try to get their hands on. But not only cyber criminals, there can also be state-level operators and there can be disgruntled employees who have lost their jobs as the result of COVID and might be tempted to use cyber attacks to get their own back. So we now face a much greater challenge in cybersecurity than we did before. This is something that we need to address on an urgent basis before we experience the catastrophic cyber attack. And this is something next week, which I want to discuss in more detail to see exactly what we should all be doing as individuals, but also what our governments and our companies should be doing to ensure that this working from home is much more cyber protected in the future. Thank you, and good day for today.